Think back with me now for a minute to the year 2000. Two countries in North America had presidential elections that year. In one country there was tumult. The ballot counting dragged on for 5 weeks, and at the end of the process there were charges of fraud. In the other country there were no charges of fraud. The results were announced promptly and accurately. The defeated candidate acknowledged his loss graciously, and the winner, a man named Vicente Fox, was gracious in his victory. Think a minute about those results. The elections in the United States, which considers itself the world's premier democracy, became a logistical nightmare, and the elections in Mexico were exemplary. That is truly an extraordinary role reversal. Throughout Mexico's entire modern political history, it's been shaped by vote fraud. Even Mexican Spanish is rich with a vocabulary of words that relate to fraud. This is a little bit like snow. The Eskimos have 100 words for snow, right? Well, in Mexico they have words that relate to fraud. They have words like el alquimista, the alchemist. In Mexico, the alchemist is a guy who comes in, he slips in behind the scenes after the election and rigs the vote for the ruling party. He turns the lead of defeat into the gold of victory. But in 2000, this kind of arcane vocabulary of disputed elections emerged not in Mexico, but in Florida. We had the hanging Chad and we had the butterfly ballot. In Mexico, in 2000, there were no hanging Chads and there were no alchemists. There were just honest elections. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a democratic revolution that occurred in Mexico. Now, Mexico has a grand history, but democracy hasn't really been a part of it, not until recently. Think with me for a minute to our two nations' Independence Day celebrations. On the 4th of July, we celebrate our independence from Britain, and we also celebrate the Declaration of Independence itself. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, Jefferson wrote. These are ideas and documents that just ring with democracy. Mexico has an Independence Day celebration on September 15th that is a truly wonderful event. I'm curious, how many people here have been to Mexico City? Well, that's a good, how many people have seen one of these September 15th Independence Day celebrations? Well, for those of you who haven't seen them, let me describe it briefly. It's on that evening that the President of Mexico and the presidents of all the towns across Mexico go to their appointed place in Mexico City. It's the balcony of the National Palace overlooking the central plaza in Mexico City. And the president directs himself to the throngs, and he says, "Que vivan los héroes que nos dieron patria y libertad," which means long live the heroes that gave us our fatherland and liberty. And the crowd shouts back, "Que viva Mexico," and their fireworks go off, and it's a truly wonderful celebration. It's a heartfelt display of national pride. But what are the concepts that are honored in this celebration? The Mexicans honor fatherland, and they honor independence from Spain, but they don't honor democracy, at least until recently. President Zedillo inserted the phrase, "Que viva nuestra democracia," I think in like 1996, but that was the first time. It was a country that didn't honor democracy because it wasn't a democracy. It was, until recently, an authoritarian state ruled by one party that had held power since 1929. The party was founded then by generals from the revolution, the victorious generals, and its function was to attenuate the conflicts that were left over between regional warlords. A series of civil wars were breaking out, and they needed this party to resolve those conflicts. Over the years, the party developed an extremely sophisticated system of control. Throughout most of the last century, the PRI, as the party was known, controlled the presidency, it controlled all but a handful of the seats in the National Congress. It controlled all 31 state governorships. It controlled the mayors in virtually all the major cities. It controlled the army. It controlled the judiciary. It controlled the farm workers' organizations. It controlled the business associations. It controlled the press through a spinning webs of bribes around the journalists. The PRI was able to determine how much money Mexicans could keep in their bank accounts. It could determine what movies were made. It could determine what stall that a local tortilla vendor would get in the local market. The Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa called the Mexican system the perfect dictatorship. Now that word perfect is important here because Mexico's system was never a totalitarian state. It was always more sophisticated and more flexible than the Soviet Union or the other one-party states across the world. At its epicenter was the president, a man with, throughout the 20th century, virtually unchecked powers. He was a kind of a Mesoamerican monarch. And the central leverage of the president's power was his right to choose his own successor through, they called it the dedazo, or the finger tap. Still, the party every 6 years at the end of the presidential term would stage a kind of a representational drama of a political campaign and allow the nation, the masses, to bask in the aura of the new leader that would be leading the Mexican nation. And then they'd have a vote, and every time the PRI candidate won the election, 12 straight elections from 1929 till 2000. During the 1970s, the opposition in Mexico actually experimented with violence. There were a number of guerrilla groups that emerged, and they were finally wiped out in a dirty war campaign run by the government. In the 1980s, the struggle shifted to electoral politics. Mexican Democrats worked to overhaul the election system to make it to make fraud difficult, to make the government make it difficult for them to steal elections. They built new opposition political parties. They started small, winning elections first in villages and towns, and then moving on to bigger struggles in cities and states. They remade their country institution by institution. And eventually, in 2000, they elected Fox. Now, I imagine you're all familiar with Fox. He's tall, he's handsome, he's charismatic, he's telegenic. And in the campaign in 2000, he was very resolute and strong in articulating the frustrations that Mexicans had with their system, and he was able to inspire them to vote on that day in July of 2000. But Fox wasn't really more than that. He was not a Nelson Mandela, and he wasn't a Lech Walesa. The Mexican Democratic Revolution didn't have a single dominant leader. It was the product of many movements whose momentum built over the years. And so we ended up with a history in which there were many visionary leaders. Their stories are rich, but they're not well known. Think of Octavio Paz, the Nobel Prize-winning poet. In 1968, at the time of the Tlatelolco massacre, Paz was the ambassador of Mexico to India, and he denounced his own government when he heard about the massacre on the BBC, and he sent a cable off and denounced his government and then resigned his post immediately. And it was a courageous act that he took that inspired many other Mexicans to stand up for their own democratic principles. Think of Luis Alvarez. He was the mayor of Chihuahua City, drawn from an opposition party, the PAN. And in 1986, in protest of an electoral fraud, he staged a hunger strike, and he stayed on it for 41 days. And in solidarity with his strike, and in protest of that fraud, thousands of Chihuahuans drove their cars out onto the Pan American Highway and blocked the traffic. They blocked the highway for, I actually did it several times. If you look on the cover of our book, you'll see a photograph of that incident where there are Chihuahuans blocking the Pan American Highway. They closed down the bridges in protest, the bridges that unite Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Texas, in protest over this electoral fraud. Think of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. In 1988, Cárdenas lent his wisdom to the movement. The government that year did not credit him with all the votes that he won in the presidential election. Many people thought that the election had been stolen from him, and vast crowds of very angry Mexicans gathered in the central square in Mexico, and they were furious with the government for this new fraud. They were eager to rush the national palace. Some people wanted to fling themselves right on the soldiers and just have an insurrection. And some of Cuauhtémoc's own leaders urged him to incite the crowd to this fury. But instead, Cuauhtémoc urged calm, and he urged that people obey the law. And so instead, he led the Mexicans not into another bloodbath, but into founding what is now Mexico's largest center-left party, the PRD. And today it's a party that stands a good chance of winning the elections, perhaps in 2006. They control Mexico City today. Now, even Ernesto Zedillo contributed in this democratic process. He was the last pre-president of the 20th century, and he had the integrity in 1997 to recognize Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas's election as mayor of Mexico City. The city had never had an opposition party mayor. It had always been ruled by the PRI. And Cuauhtémoc won the election, and Zedillo recognized it, much to the disgruntlement of his own party. And this is the performance that he repeated in 2000. He recognized Fox's victory, and it was an act of, it was an amazing democratic contribution. Again, his party was very disgruntled. So what's changed in Mexico, and what's remained the same in the 3 years since the July 2000 elections? Somebody once asked Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist leader, to evaluate the impact of the 1789 French Revolution. It's too early to tell, he said. Well, in Mexico, things have gotten clearer a bit more quickly. In Mexico today, we can say that Mexico is today less presidential, less authoritarian, less centralized, more open to the world than it has ever been. This is not to say that democracy has solved all of Mexico's problems, or that every Mexican institution is now democratic. What's the news breaking out of Mexico as we speak? The headlines focus on videotapes that show politicians, some of whom emerged in this long democratic struggle, engaged in acts of corruption. They're accepting bribes on videotape. It's disappointing to see. It's not terribly surprising, because democracy has not abolished human greed. The hope is that Mexicans will develop the mechanisms of accountability for holding their politicians and officials to a more honest performance. The good news is that citizens have begun developing some of these tools. During the pre-era, getting basic information about government operations was often like pulling teeth. They held information as though it was a state secret. A couple of years ago, a group of journalists and lawyers and academics drafted a new Freedom of Information law, and the Congress passed this law unanimously. It's a modest measure, but it's one tool that can help to keep officials in Mexico honest. But what's the larger problem of accountability? The problem is that Mexico's legal system still doesn't work very well. For ordinary citizens, rule of law remains an aspiration. The problems are many in the legal system. Only a tiny proportion of crimes are reported, and just as small a percentage of those crimes are then ever punished. 4 or 5 years ago, a couple of academics studied Mexico's main police academy, and they found that right in the academy, instructors were teaching police how to shake down citizens for bribes. The prosecutors in Mexico, called the Ministerios Públicos, it's a large class of people that are kind of like the gateway to the justice system. They're undertrained and they're underpaid. Judges, especially at the federal level, there are 500 federal judges, they're well-trained and many of them are capable and dedicated. But they face daunting problems with the legal system itself. Think of the instrument called the amparo. The amparo is the fundamental procedure by which Mexicans appeal sentences, file habeas corpus petitions, seek injunctions, and contest the constitutionality of laws. One of the curious features of this amparo writ is that Supreme Court rulings that declare Mexican laws unconstitutional in amparo suits apply only to the victorious plaintiff. They don't apply to the whole society. So all other Mexicans must continue to follow and adhere to the same law that's already been declared unconstitutional. And so the result of this is that it forces, or the other option they have, of course, is filing their own constitutional complaint against the same law that's already been declared unconstitutional. So the result of it is that it forces the Supreme Court to consider the same law and the constitutionality of the law over and over again. And the court does this endlessly. I once interviewed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and during our interview, he was working his way through a tall stack of writs. He was signing scores and scores of rulings. All the time he was talking to me for our hour interview. It was an evidence of the court's tremendous workload. In 1999, the Mexican Supreme Court issued 7,000 rulings. In that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court issued 75 rulings. So reforming and strengthening the law enforcement and justice systems remains one of Mexico's largest areas of unfinished business. It's a task, by the way, that will take not just a sexennial or one presidential term, but will probably take a generation to carry out. What else has changed or remained the same in these 3 years? There seems to be genuinely good news on the narcotics front. There have been arrests of top traffickers in all the major mafias. The river of drugs keeps flowing northward through Mexico to meet U.S. demand. We're the cause of this. We're buying the drugs. So the river keeps flowing. But in the last decade of pre-rule, the most profoundly disturbing aspect of the drug trade was its corrosion of political institutions at the highest level. There were well-founded suspicions that there were officials in the Mexican White House that were brokering the cocaine trade. Now it seems that these ties that were forged between federal officials and the drug mafias during the pre-era are unraveling. Now, does that mean we'll never hear of another governor or another general or another judge who is somehow mixed up in the drug trade? On that one, we'll have to say it's too early to tell. There are other mafias. Most of the country's labor federations are still headed by the same corrupt holdovers from the pre-regime. Democracy hasn't arrived at the workplace yet. It hasn't arrived at many business boardrooms either. Corporate governance is a hotly debated issue in Mexico now, although, to be fair to them, I've not heard of a single Mexican corporation that has been accused of cheating its shareholders like Enron or Tyco. Life hasn't changed much so far in the shanty towns that surround the maquiladora plants along the northern border. Corporations there pay $10 or $11 a day, and they don't pay much in Mexican taxes. And as a result, in many of these settlements, there's no money for building potable water lines or sewage treatment plants. During his 2000 campaign, President Fox, or candidate Fox, promised to fight poverty and underdevelopment vigorously. And his central strategy was going to be an educational revolution. He was going to spend umpteen billion pesos to improve all the Mexican schools. This hasn't really gotten off the ground. The fact is that the Mexican state doesn't have billions of pesos to spend on Mexican schools. Fox has proposed raising revenues through energy and tax initiatives. that would help set aside public money for spending on social issues. But the Congress he's not been able to get the Congress to approve these measures. What's the problem? Well, for one thing, Fox has proved to be not a tremendously expert negotiator. He's clumsy in his negotiations with Congress, and the Congress is divided up among three parties, and no party has a majority. So it's a difficult task, and he's not really proven to be expert at it. But at the same time, Mexicans are unsure themselves about the wisdom of these initiatives. Fox's government calls them modernizing reforms, and the left calls them giveaways to the business class. And so you have an ambivalence in the electorate that's reflected in the Congress. The Congress is now a democratic institution. So Fox can't just ram through these initiatives the way, say, Carlos Salinas could a decade ago. People say, well, there's legislative impasse. This is gridlock. I read an article in Foreign Affairs magazine last month that called Mexico an ungovernable democracy because of this legislative impasse. But let's put this in perspective. Here in the United States, we have very serious problems. We have the problem of our underfunded social security system. We have the problem of our rapidly spiraling health care costs. How effective has our political system been at confronting these costs and these problems and coming to some sort of consensus about them? We could say we have legislative impasse. No one is saying so far that the United States is an ungovernable democracy. What are some of the clearest ways that democracy has made a difference so far in Mexico? Let's talk about immigration. Millions of Mexicans feel very strongly about the conditions faced by undocumented workers in our country. We have a vast underclass of Mexicans who work here virtually without civil rights. Nearly 500 Mexicans died trying to cross the border last year, trying to get here to do work that Americans need done but can't do themselves. Fox picked up on the concerns that Mexicans feel about this, and as a candidate, he pledged to work to change the framework that governs labor migration in North America. As president, he's pursued these initiatives, or the idea of discussing the immigration framework with Washington much more vigorously than any of his predecessors. Now President Bush has offered a new immigration proposal. He deserves credit for opening the debate on this issue again after it was closed for a couple of years after the events of 9/11. So that the president's proposal doesn't remain just rhetoric, he needs to back it up with a specific legislative proposal so that the work can shift to Congress. But what's the point? The point is that this is a case where Mexican public opinion has placed an issue, one of North America's most pressing social issues, on the U.S. political agenda. That's new. This is Mexican democracy making itself felt. For most of the past 3 years, however, official Washington hasn't seemed to notice that Mexico has experienced a fundamental change. What was our approach to Mexico in the diplomacy at the United Nations during the lead-up to the Iraq War? Washington took pretty much the same approach that it's taken to Latin nations for 50 years. The message to Mexico was, you're our Latin neighbor, you're in our backyard, so we'll be counting on your vote at the Security Council. But they didn't recognize that there'd been a change. By overwhelming margins, Mexicans didn't approve of a preemptive war in Iraq. President Fox had his ear to the opinion polls and to the opinions of the Mexican people. And unlike Jose Maria Aznar in Spain, he declined to endorse a war that Mexicans didn't support. Now, this wasn't the first time that Mexico and its foreign policy diverged from Washington's view of things, but it was new in the sense that it wasn't sort of a Cold War balancing act. President Bush seemed to take it almost like a personal insult that Mexico didn't vote with the U.S. at the Security Council, but it was a decision that was thoroughly grounded in the reality of Mexican public opinion. That's the very definition of democracy. So how to summarize? Mexico is today an electoral democracy, but much of its political culture remains stuck back in that authoritarian era. Still, there's a lot of talk about democracy now around the world. And in this context, Mexico's democracy and its accomplishment seems extraordinary. For the past year, the United States has been trying to export democracy to Iraq. The occupation officials there have wanted to schedule direct national elections quickly, but they can't. They're wringing their hands over their problem. What is it? Well, they've found that in Iraq, the voter lists are inaccurate or out of date. The political parties are weak or non-existent. In this same period, Julia Preston and I have been working on this book, and so it's been difficult for us not to make comparisons between Iraq and Mexico. Voter registry? In Mexico, they spent billions of dollars over much of a decade to create a digital fingerprint and embed it in each of the national voter registry cards that the voters carry with them to vote. They created a very sophisticated voter registry that's one of the most modern in the world now. Political parties, Mexicans spent years and years founding and then building and strengthening their opposition political parties. What's the point? Democracy doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun. Mexico may have unfinished tasks on its democratic agenda, but in Iraq it will take years, perhaps decades, for a system to develop that is as democratic as the one that's flourishing in Mexico today. Mexican democracy wasn't imported by an occupying army. Mexicans built it themselves. Now, the difference between writing news articles, newspaper stories, and writing a journalistic history like our book is the difference between creating headlines and charting trend lines. As correspondents in Mexico, our job was to pursue topics that were often difficult or even embarrassing for our Mexican hosts. We wrote about drug trafficking, and we wrote about dysfunctional institutions, and we wrote about army abuses. But we were fortunate. We were lucky enough to stay in Mexico long enough to see past our own headlines. We could see that we were covering the last years of a long and inspiring national renovation. We saw common Mexicans feel new powers. The power to protect a pristine beach from development by some hotel chain. The power that neighbors feel when they work together to prevent crime. The power that taxpayers feel when they confront red tape in a government office. So, in writing our book, we got to chart the trend lines, and in Mexico they were very clear. The Mexicans fought a long and extraordinary struggle for democracy and for democratic rights, and they eventually won a great victory. Thank you for listening to me.